We discussed already migration, the future financial framework, and also Brexit, just to mention a few of these items. Citizens, on the one hand, may now realize more the added value of belonging to the EU, being a global player, as it was also mentioned by our State Secretary before. Others are concerned about the future direction of the European Union. Last year we celebrated 60 years of the Treaty of Rome. The European Commission published a white paper, and many ideas have discussed in the past year, and I had the chance to discuss very often with the first Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, the future of the European Union, especially speaking of subsidiarity, proportionality, and doing less but more efficiently, as our task force is called, and hopefully can finish tomorrow its work. So I welcome Frans Timmermans, first Vice President of the European Commission. Warm welcome to you. And second, to Mairead McGuinness, first Vice President of the European Parliament. And dear colleagues, you know our procedure. I invite now Frans Timmermans, the first Vice President, and then Madam First Vice President McGuinness to take the floor. During their speeches, you have the time for requests. Yeah, that's the procedure. And now I would like to ask Mr. Frans Timmermans to take the floor.
Thank you very much. And do you want me to, from there? Okay. Thank you very much, and let me start by thanking the Austrian Presidency for their kind hospitality. I had the good fortune of having to be here on Thursday and Friday with the entire Commission, and decided to stay over the weekend for this meeting on Monday, and I had a really wonderful weekend in this wonderful, wonderful city. I've been coming back here since the 1970s, and I've seen it change, and if ever one would like to see how Europe has changed over the last 40 years, you should actually have sort of a time-lapse video of Vienna starting in, let's say, 1970 and ending today, and then you would see the huge transformation our societies have gone through. And I have to say, 90% of that is positive and very, very positive. The core of the problem we are facing today is, I believe, that the promise of convergence, which is inherent in any social contract, whether it is in our member states or whether it is at the European level, that promise was strongly undermined by the series of crises we have had in the last 15 years. I think the latest manifestation of this crisis, which is the migration crisis, is now the crisis that is playing a role in every single member state, in the national politics, but it's also arguably the most fundamental challenge to the European Union to date. And I believe the European Union could only be challenged by this crisis because there are underlying weaknesses in our construction, and I believe the most challenging underlying weakness of the structure is the lack of convergence between member states. The whole idea of the European Union is that we bring member states together, that they share their destiny, and by doing so, that everyone is brought to a better situation. Well, at the end of these crises, when we're still struggling to get out of it, regardless of the huge improvement in our economy, one fact I want to mention: there are more jobs in Europe today than ever before in Europe's history. Regardless of that, there is a strong feeling of anxiety in large parts of the population, and that is also something that is projected on the European project, simply because member states do not trust each other anymore to the level that we need. So how are we going to bring back more trust? How are we going to create more convergence? I think much will depend on the quality of the proposals that will be put on the table. Much will also depend on the audacity of national leaders to advocate European solutions where national solutions no longer bring results. And that is what President Macron would call European sovereignty, but you can name it however you like. And much will also depend on the way we work, not just the results of our policies. And this is actually what I wanted to dwell upon this morning. Tomorrow, my task force on subsidiarity proportionality will present its report to President Juncker. Dr. Lopatka has been an integral and very important part of that task force. Without wanting to share already today, that would not be nice to my colleagues on the task force, the concrete conclusions. In general terms, I think what we will be advocating is that we look at the lack of legitimacy of what we're doing in the European Union, and that we look at improving that legitimacy also by improving the way we work, improving the way we draft legislation, we implement legislation, the way we engage with national parliaments, with regional parliaments that have legislative competences, and with local authorities in how we formulate and implement legislation. Part of legitimacy will come from that. People feel legislation is legitimized if people feel they are part of drafting it and part of implementing it. If this is something that comes from elsewhere, then the legitimacy problem would remain. So we need legislation that is more fit for purpose, but only creating a better form of legislation is not going to increase our legitimacy. But it's an essential part of it. So these are two communicating vessels. On the one hand, the way we legislate should change quite radically, I believe. On the other hand, this will not yield the results we want if at the same time the quality of the products we deliver to our citizens isn't increased either. So the results should also demonstrate the necessity of what we are doing. It is paradoxical that this European crisis should happen in the context of the economic situation we're in, which will at some point become worse again. So we should use the opportunity we have now. The other paradox is one of an international dimension. A lot of the unrest or anxiety in our societies is linked with the effects of globalization. And people feel, justifiably so, that globalization is a challenge to their own position. They might be happy today, but where will they be tomorrow? Where will their children be in the day after tomorrow? This is a large part of the anxiety in our society. And the reflex to that is then to take back control by becoming more, by concentrating more on the nation state as a solution to all our problems. Now that reflex is understandable because our social models were created by the nation state. So I understand that reflex, but one should also analyze more carefully which are the instruments we have today to create a state and a society based on our values. Is the nation state, is its scale big enough in an age of globalization to offer those solutions? Is its scale big enough to face the challenge of an American president who, for some reason I still don't understand, believes it's in America's interest to have a divided Europe rather than a united Europe? Is it strong enough, the nation state, to face the challenge posed by China or by Russia? The answer to all these questions from me is no. I think we need the European scale, just the scale, and we need to agree on the European values, because I believe that is the scale of action that will be necessary in a world that is globalizing so fast. This fourth industrial revolution affects us every single human being on this planet, more than any other previous industrial revolution, at a pace that we did not think was possible before. So if you really want to find answers to that challenge, I think we as Europeans need to stick together. But if we really want to convince our citizens that the way forward is a collective European way forward, that we need to show that what we perform collectively as Europeans actually does carry results and positive results. So to get out of this illusion that referring or going back to the nation state and disconnecting from a European approach is a better way of regaining control of our future, to get rid ourselves of that illusion, and I do believe it's an illusion. We need to change the way we legislate, and we also need to prove that the way we legislate delivers the results. And the task force I had the honor to head looks at the way we legislate. But we collectively, responsible for policies in Europe, should also look at the quality of what we deliver. And I think the quality of what we deliver cannot be guaranteed without full participation of national parliaments. And this goes beyond the control of subsidiarity and proportionality, although it's a very important part of your work and our work. It also goes right to the heart of owning what we decide at the European level. And I believe that a change of attitude in both Brussels and the member states is necessary, and let me end on that. If we really want our citizens to become engaged again, it would have to start with ourselves being engaged again, also at the national level. Break with a tradition that when things work well, they were created in the capitals, and when things go sour, that's Brussels' fault. Whatever we do together. If it works, we own it together. If it doesn't work, we also own it together, and we take responsibility collectively. I think that is the way forward. I hope at a future COSAC meeting we will be, Dr. Lopatka and I especially, be able to discuss the results of our task force. I honestly hope also that the report of the task force will enable us to engage in a dialogue with the European Parliament about the results, because legislation is made by 3 institutions, not just by 1. And I hope this will help us increase the legitimacy we need at the level of our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, first Vice President. And now our next speaker will be the Vice President of the European Parliament, Ms. McGuinness.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here with Vice President Timmermans talking about Europe and the future and its perspectives. But let me throw out a challenge to you, because I think we speak often about the challenges that Europe faces without realizing that we will forever face challenges. And it is not something that we're ever going to get rid of. They're just different challenges. And I think what I feel from the side of the European Parliament, and I'm interested to hear your observations as elected representatives, is we are judged by how we deal with those challenges, not the idea that we can prevent them happening or that we can absolutely insulate our citizens from the reality that the world is a harsh place. And in that harsh place, the European Union is perhaps the safest of havens. And therefore, when Vice President Timmermans speaks about the anxieties that our citizens feel, to some extent that is absolutely true. It is reflected in many member states, but the news is also positive, because the Eurobarometer shows us that we are seeing that 2/3 of our citizens are now more positive about the European Union than they would have been in the 1980s. So something is moving, and that the trust that we are concerned about here is being rebuilt. Part of that may be down to one of the biggest challenges that we face, which is evolving, and that is the Brexit scenario. I have found that in many member states, and my own included, and in the European Parliament, where we thought we understood everything about Europe, many colleagues began to understand more deeply what the single market means, how the customs union works, the significance of free movements, the ability of students to be educated across the European Union. And in that wider understanding, against a very difficult background of Brexit, people are beginning to think. And we should allow them the space to think and help them in their thought process. I hope you get a sense from our side to the European Parliament and my personal commitment to this job that I have of dialogue with national parliaments. We take this very seriously. I think in my very first intervention at one of these meetings, I said very clearly that, as far as I'm concerned, the European Union is nothing without our member states and your parliaments. You are the direct link to citizens. But you and I have the same job. I am elected and you are elected. We represent the same people. And therefore, we should see where we can work better together. I've also made the observation that one of our difficulties is, in this fast-moving world, is the time for political reflection, where we're not always responding to challenges and crises and agendas, but where we set the agenda. And I think these meetings under the presidencies are really key in setting an agenda that isn't driven by the immediate, but where we have time to reflect as colleagues. I'm very interested in what Vice President Timmermans has said about the task force, and I believe the European Parliament will want to work very well when we see the conclusions of the task force, because it should help to make Europe stronger. And the idea that the national parliaments are more directly involved in legislation is obviously key. But we also need to be quite aware that there are so many pieces of legislation happening at the same time that it is well nigh impossible for any one individual member of a parliament to know everything that is going on. So we also need to have an understanding that there are specialist committees in your parliaments and in ours who deal with specialist issues. But also to say to you as national parliamentarians, our door is always open. We are contactable all the time on pieces of legislation. And yes, legislation can be changed and amended, and it adds to the complications perhaps. But it still is the same way that legislation is formed in your own member states. So again, it is finding a way of how we engage better with the national parliaments at the beginning of the process, during the process, and not only at the end. And this is where Vice President Timmermans mentioned implementation. And all too often we get real engagement with national parliamentarians when we are implementing. And that's very often too late for any change or any evolution to take place. I would also say to you that many of you are part of political groups, as I am in the Parliament and other colleagues. Could we not do better together, the political groupings between the European Parliament and our member states? I'm putting that challenge to myself, because I think we are not using our structures, or we're not engaging effectively in what is available already to us. I'm rather against the idea that we create more structures, because very few of us have additional time in our busy schedules for that. But we could use those structures we have much better to engage. And there's also the reality, let's face it, as a former journalist, it is much easier to get attention when you're criticising something. And criticising Brussels is one of the best ticket items to get a headline. How many of us are prepared and brave enough to stop doing that constantly? To do it only where it is appropriate, so that we get progress, not just a headline. And that's a challenge for everyone involved in politics. Two issues, Chair, I want to mention very briefly before I conclude, because I'm interested in your observations. One, let me first talk about Brexit. It is, I suppose, symbolic that today the Chancellor of Austria, Chancellor Kurz, is in my constituency along the border with Northern Ireland, and I very much welcome his presence there today. I dare say it will be certainly not overshadowed, but it will be enhanced because of what has happened overnight in the United Kingdom. And I think all of us who want a very good solution on the negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union will be mindful that there is another political drama which will impact on those negotiations, if not on the timeline itself, perhaps also on the detail. And I suppose what that speaks to me is that the word compromise, I think I'm the first to mention that word this morning, is seen in some quarters as a weakness. And frankly, if you cannot compromise, that is your greatest weakness. I all the time have to compromise in the European Parliament. But it doesn't mean that I don't defend the principles on which I was elected by people, but I am prepared to take on board the concerns of others. And I hope that in this Brexit process, which has been a rather stop-start and alarming evolution, that we can see that there is a road necessary to travel, and that is a road to compromise. But as I said at the outset, we also see how difficult it is to extract a member state from a relationship which has been so long in the making and so deep in the process that doing it without harm, in my view, is impossible. And therefore, I repeat our objective, which is to minimise the damage to the European Union and the United Kingdom from this very, very difficult process. I mentioned in my intervention earlier that I hope that we have sufficient time to deal with all of these issues of the withdrawal treaty and transition before next March is concluded. But if we don't, we have to look at what the options are for us and how we deal with this current uncertainty. And finally, the European Parliament elections take place in May of next year. As they say in my country, I have skin in the game here because I hope to contest those elections. But I also have a bigger priority. I'm a mother of 4 children. Many of you are parents in this room. And I think very deeply about these issues when we speak of migration and security. And I say to my children, who are young adults, that in a way, what we do will perhaps not impact me or my generation, but will certainly have a profound impact on them and their children. And the idea that we can simply protect without speaking of being global in our approach to development concerns in the wider world, that will not be a good solution for our children and their children. So we owe it, as we speak towards the European elections. Obviously, they will be dominated by national issues. That is the truth of all elections. But in those elections, I hope to find space to speak of the bigger issues. I think it's our best opportunity to do that because we have perhaps not quite settled all of the difficulties around banking union and the economy, but we're making progress and we're seeing growth restored. And now is the time to talk about the challenges that Europe faces, but also our duty as a very strong global partner to continue to show leadership, not just on those questions I've mentioned, but on wider issues like climate change and human rights that are absolutely vital. Again, I repeat to you my absolute commitment to work with you in partnership. The European Parliament is nothing without our member states and our colleagues. And I hope that my engagement on behalf of the Parliament and those colleagues who've come to meetings from the European Parliament gives testimony to that absolute commitment. And I look forward to your views. And I hope you'll challenge us, as I'm sure you will. Thank you.
Thank you, both our speakers. Colleagues, now we move on to the panel discussion. 18 colleagues signed up for the debate. Please hold your remarks within 3 minutes. The time will be displayed on the screen. We start with our Finnish colleague, Arto Satonen.
Chair, dear colleagues, at first I would like to thank our speakers about giving a big picture. I think that your powerful messages like more people have jobs than ever in Europe or the EU is the safest place in a harsh world, they are very important points. I think that any organization when faced with division can find unity by focusing on its strengths. The European Union has many of strengths. The single market and the growing network of free trade areas between Europe and other regions, as well as the Schengen area, are more important to our citizens' well-being than our current subjects of disagreement. The EU's trade policy is under attack precisely because it is the source of Europe's strength. The answer is to reinforce our trade policy and build new alliances. No one wants a trade war, but giving up the rules-based trading system may be even worse. It is gratifying that the European Union could easily unite on developing a common defence capacity. The multifunctional framework process is an opportunity to develop our strengths. We must not exaggerate the disagreements on the MFF. In democracies, budget debates are never easy or fast. There is a general agreement that the EU as a whole will benefit from putting our money towards our strong points. Finalising the single market finally will create new jobs. Digitalisation and the circular economy are most promising investments. Putting money to the research and development promotes economic growth in Europe. Europe has much to gain from opening the Arctic for sustainable development. We need to look again at agriculture. With global warming and desertification, Europe's food supply can only grow in importance. For Finland, it's maintaining the strategic resilience of the domestic food supply is an important issue for us. The future is built from present. If we focus on getting our budgetary framework in order, develop a common defence and reinforcing our trade, we will do much to ensure the future of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Arto Satonen. The next speaker from Ireland, Terry Lydon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thanks to Frans Timmermans, First Vice President of the Commission, and indeed to First Vice President Mairead McGuinness of the European Parliament. Thank you for a very interesting contribution to this debate today. We're particularly pleased in Ireland that we have our MEP from my own constituency of the West as First Vice President of the European Parliament, particularly at this crucial stage. And indeed, I would have made a different speech this morning if I wasn't aware that David Davis had resigned as the chief negotiator for the United Kingdom, because this now reaches a stage where Michel Barnier has nobody to negotiate at this point in time until somebody else is appointed. And where is the white paper on the negotiations? Will it be published, or is it now irrelevant? And you know, the challenges we have, and I've said this before, and Mairead McGuinness is aware of the very detail, as she said. The Chancellor of Austria is there today on the border, 500 kilometres, 1.1 billion a week in trade with the United Kingdom. So we are the most affected of all the European Union countries. That's why we are concentrating on this, because for 2 years there's been no progress since June 2016. Now we're on a countdown to March 2019, and we're expected to conclude a major agreement with the United Kingdom. Now, anyone that knows the situation, I was representing when the Single European Act was negotiated many years ago, and the complications of those negotiations. And I also believe there's also a more interesting possibility of an economic zone being created between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, supported by the European Union, bearing in mind that Ireland itself is only 1% of the population of the European Union. So there must be imagination used in coming up with a solution. But unless we have some negotiation on the other side, then we're in abeyance at this point in time, bearing in mind that March 2019 is when the British government are leaving, the United Kingdom are leaving. So there'll have to be an extension of the period for a period of long negotiations to ensure that we have continuity of services and issues arising, because it's unthinkable for us in Ireland to feel that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union without an agreement with the European Union. So I plead all sides at this stage to get back to negotiation, start real negotiations, and bear in mind the challenges we face in the European Union in relation to Brexit. It is the most significant challenge since the foundation of the European Union and the EC 60 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. The next speaker, Jean Bisset from the French Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank and congratulate the two speakers, Mr. Timmermans and Madam McGuinness. Now, as far as the setting up of the European Union is concerned, or reforms, well, we need to have solid and predictable bases that are also understood by our citizens. Now, Europe, of course, needs to act there where the value added is quite clear. Subsidiarity, after all, means simplification. These need to be our priorities always. At the same time, the role of national parliaments needs to be strengthened and enhanced. Here I talk about the right to initiate proceedings. Transparency in decision-making processes, that's also important. And Europe, of course, needs to also respect human rights, fundamental rights, human dignity, as well as democratic principles. Our citizens feel that they feel the constraints of hesitation. It's difficult for them to understand the complexity of standards, and sometimes these standards are not all that legitimate. But Europe, of course, our citizens feel does not find responses to unemployment, immigration, and so on and so forth. So they place expectations in us. Europe needs to focus on its strengths with regards to security and safety in the field of immigration. I also talk about trade policy, global policies that are pursued, and I also talk about defense, and that's why we very much acknowledge the progress made with regards to permanent structural cooperation. Europe needs to have an industrial ambition, needs to focus on jobs, digitization, energy supply. All this, of course, is of great importance. We should also launch initiatives. Airbus, Ariane are the catchwords. This needs to go on. And then, of course, a European supercomputer. That should also be taken into consideration. As far as competition policy is concerned, well, Europe, of course, needs to focus on industry. Europe shouldn't just focus on the relevant markets and predominant position. Now, of course, there should be greater emphasis placed on cooperation. Member states need to make important contributions. Now, we shouldn't delude ourselves. We're 27. Not everyone is prepared. Europe can only achieve progress if it goes together. Then, of course, social and territorial cohesion, that's what you also alluded to. And that's why the multi-annual financial framework needs to make sure that there is cohesion, that there is ambitious and efficient cohesion. And we also need a common agricultural policy that is able to contribute to food security as well as European food sovereignty. We tend to forget this. We tend to forget this in times like these. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker, Richard Herzig from Hungary.
Thank you, the floor, Mr. Chairman, dear Mr. and Madam Vice Presidents, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank for the outstanding lectures given by the two Vice Presidents. According to the future of the European Union, I would like to raise some points on behalf of the Hungarian Parliament. As we know, the future of the European Union will largely shaped by the current challenges of illegal migration, the next MFF, Brexit, or institutional issues. First, regarding the illegal migration, the Austrian Presidency has all the mandate from the European Council to stop the illegal migratory flows to Europe. Second, regarding the next MFF, I am less enthusiastic about the Commission's proposal. We simply cannot accept financing new priorities by significantly reducing the resources of cohesion policy and common agriculture policy. In addition, it is also unprecedented that those member states which have been implementing successful economic reforms are facing significantly less sources. Thirdly, on Brexit, the unity of the European Union 27 member states should be preserved as a key aspect, but at the same time, we will also have to envisage a comprehensive agreement on future relations. And at this stage, the Irish border issue is a real stumbling block to advancement of the Brexit negotiations. In addition, I would like to mention to you, my dear colleagues, that every member state's legislation has its national historical traditions. The different national legislation cannot be measured by the same yardstick. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I do hope that the report of the Subsidiarity Task Force will duly include the comments and suggestions raised by the National Parliament, and the Commission will take recent opinions of national parliaments into account in a more structured way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Richard Hössig. Our next speaker, Isabella Klotz from the Polish Sejm.
Państwo Przewodniczący, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say I fully agree with what Vice President Timmermans said. His propositions are true, and I would appeal to everybody. Let's look for the best possible solutions for security and well-being of our citizens. We should be getting closer to each other, not farther away. The European project has to be rooted in the political reality of individual member states. We have to respect national identities that have been shaped for centuries. And irrespective of the diversity of our countries and nations, which Poland very much values, we believe it's a very big value for the EU, but our strength is and should be the unity on issues that are key for our citizens. It's an EU for everybody, so everybody should feel ownership of this project. And that's why looking for compromise should be the way we move forward. All the member states should be taken into account at the same level when political decisions are made. And I think that streamlining the yellow card process is absolutely necessary. We are satisfied that what the Polish government proposed 2 years ago about the future of the EU is now becoming true. I remember what I said during the meeting of the speakers of parliaments in Rome. Mr. Timmermans was also there, and I talked about economies of scale. And I'm very happy to see that Mr. Timmermans also mentioned it. It is absolutely crucial that we evaluate the situation in the EU in a very honest way. We have to acknowledge that we need reforms in the EU. The cohesion of the 27 countries is absolutely top priority, and national governments and parliaments should be at the heart of the political process in the EU. And also, like in the case of migration, the Polish recipe is becoming more and more widely accepted, as I can hear from your interventions. We also postulated strengthening our external borders and helping in third countries. These were our postulates, and I'm happy to see that more and more people are accepting them now. Now, we have to now talk about the multi-annual financial framework and the negotiation of the framework. As Mrs. Vassilieva from Bulgaria said in the previous session, she mentioned that cohesion policy and common agricultural policy, she said, were the DNA of the EU. The solution that we work out in this area has to ensure the stability of all of the EU. However, the convergence process has not been completed yet. It is still underway. And that's why we believe that per capita GDP should remain the basic indicator on the basis of which the financial means are divided. The new priorities that have been set forth, that Poland agrees with, have to provide for a system of financing where this bloodstream of the EU, or this DNA, is not limited. And by this I mean cohesion policy and common agricultural policy. And we want to emphasize that the cuts for countries in Central and Eastern Europe are disproportionately large. And to wrap up, let me say that in the European Parliament, Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki mentioned 3 aspects in his recent presentation. And he mentioned where we should go forward with the EU. The Union 4.0, a safe union, and a union that meets the expectations of the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. The next speaker is from the Italian Senate, Ettore Antonio Di Chiari.
Signor Vice Presidente,
Mr. Vice President, dear colleagues, Madam Vice President, dear colleagues, I am taking part today for the first time in a COSAC meeting, and I would like to thank you, everyone, for your best wishes, for the best wishes you made this morning, and I am very happy to be here. I am a member of an institution, the Italian Senate, which has always been a firm supporter of the European project and a firm supporter of the need for effective democratic participation of national parliaments. The first Vice President of the European Parliament, Mrs. McGuinness, said a few moments ago that we must enable people to talk, to reflect, to interact with the institutions. And as a member of the Five-Star Movement, the ideal forum for the free exchange of ideas and thoughts among web users, I can only confirm this pro-European policy. However, we must recognize that the European Union has not been able to provide solutions on many issues that are considered priorities by our citizens. And I'm talking about the management of migration flows and the free circulation of people in the Schengen area. But I'm also talking about the issue of economic inequalities, youth unemployment, and temporary work. These are all issues that call for collective European responses, not just national responses. And so I hope that the conclusions of the June European Council will be translated into concrete measures, and I hope that every member state will do its part to ensure the European spirit that I have been able to breathe here for the first time. On the issues of growth and development, I believe it is essential to provide the Union with the necessary resources for its smooth operation, and the debate on the forthcoming multi-annual financial framework should lead us to find new budget items to support the fight against poverty and also to support investment in research and innovation. Poverty, dear colleagues, is not to be fought against within banks. Marginalization is not to be fought against along borders. Poverty and marginalization are to be fought against in schools. And lastly, I would like to underline here an issue with that my party, Five-Star Movement, has focused on. We support all forms of participatory and direct democracy, and the Lisbon Treaty has foreseen an instrument for citizens' initiative that has to be further improved. Well, during consideration of the reform of Regulation 211 of 2011, last June the 20th, 2018, the European Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee has proposed the involvement of national parliaments in the Citizens' Initiative instrument, so that citizens can feel that they are supported not only at European level, but also and especially at national level in their proposals. This is a minimum effort, Mr. Vice President and Timmermans, that we can make together. It's a joint effort to strengthen the trust between people and institutions that in history has always been the lifeblood of all liberties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker from Montenegro, Maria Katovic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union has faced many challenges in the previous period, such as the economic crisis, migration crisis, and Brexit. Now it is evident that these events were an opportunity for a wider self-reflection on the future, the perspective of the Union. In my opinion, the EU is now stronger and more united than ever. One of the most important tasks now is the discussion regarding its multi-annual financial framework after 2020, particularly having in mind the implication of Brexit and the new policy initiative. In this regard, we in Montenegro are committed to advancing in the political and economic reforms so that we become the next EU member during the next financial perspective. So we hope that the next MFF will also count for financing and budgetary priorities related to the EU enlargement. I would also like to thank the Austrian Presidency for recognizing the importance of the EU enlargement, or better to say, unity of countries which share the same European political, societal and cultural identity. We believe that the EU enlargement will not only help the countries of the Western Balkans, but will also contribute to a more secure, stable and prosperous Europe. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. Next speaker, Gunther Kriechbaum, Deutscher Bundestag.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Licheri, who comes from the Cinque Stelle movement, and I'd like to appeal to him. Well, referenda should be made available in unrestricted fashion. But what happened, what would have happened to Europe after the war? Well, if Charles de Gaulle, as France's first president, a few years after the end of World War II, when Nazi Germany had committed atrocious crimes in Europe and especially in France. Now, if Charles de Gaulle had asked his French people the following question, well, would you like to form a community with Germany? Would you like to set up a coal and steel community? Well, if he had done that, this referendum would have had a result that we can all imagine. That's the difference between politicians and statesmen. Some politicians think in terms of office, and others have a longer vision in mind. And this brings me to the issue of Brexit. Prime Minister Cameron asked his people, well, he was the one who announced the referendum in his first Bloomberg speech, and that was not out of necessity. He was not put under national pressure. He was not even put under pressure of his own party. No, it was his own group that put pressure on him. Bill Cash, who is not here today, and many others, well, they put pressure on him and made life difficult for him. And he thought that opting for the referendum would be the right approach. And that's why we're talking about these things, because there was a lack of courage on the part of those that should have had and should have assumed responsibility. Now, Frans Timmermans, the first Vice President, well, I would like to ask him about what he thinks of Chequers and the resignation of the chief negotiator, who, by the way, had not always been well prepared for the Brussels meeting, but Michel Barnier knows all about that. Now, what I would be interested in is the following. What is the stance of the Commission? Now, the 4 fundamental freedoms are indivisible. That's what always said. So the Chequers decision, of course, falls short of this then. It's a very complicated tariff agreement, customs agreement, and I don't really know what this is all about, but of course there are experts involved at the Commission. Well, how will this be put into practice? Now, the European Union always talks about reducing bureaucracy and red tape, but how is this supposed to work? I don't really know. The 4 fundamental freedoms, of course, everyone says that the 4 fundamental freedoms are and will be indivisible. So what's the take of the Commission on this? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gunther.
Next speaker, Bojan Kekic from Slovenia.
Thank you for the floor. Dear colleagues, today the European Union is once again at the crossroad, dealing with a number of challenges as the migrant crisis, Brexit, and negotiations for the next financial framework post-2020. The negotiations for the next financial framework post-2020 are at the beginning, but from the Commission proposal we can see that funds for some of the traditional policies will be lowered and some new policies will be added. The cohesion policy is one of the most successful European Union policies which diminished the inequalities among member states and regions in the European Union for already 30 years. I strongly believe that we should not overlook the success and overarching effects of these policies when dealing with the new challenges. I agree that the next financial framework should be agreed as soon as possible and encourage a wide debate not only in the member states but also in regions and local communities which unboundedly have the stronger link with citizens. As regarding the migration crisis, I would like to stress out that we really need to focus on protecting our external borders and solving this issue at its source. We should take more efforts to find a more suitable community solution for all member states, which would not amount to building walls among members of the European Union, but in building a strong and safe European which will provide its citizens with a high level of security and still guarantee all the 4 freedoms to its citizens. Finally, I would like to say a few words about the scenarios for the future of the European Union. When I read the white paper of the future of the European Union, I really worried about some scorecards mentioned in that document. By 2030, the Europeans will be the oldest population in the world with an average of 45 years, and demographic will be one of the main issues for the future. In 1900, Europe accounted for around 25% of the global population. By 2016, it will account for less than 5% of the global population, with no single members having more than 1% of the world population. We cannot be too optimistic about the future competitiveness, which can remain an enable level only through high investment in knowledge and high added industry. We had to aware that our future lies in the young people, in knowledge and education, and we have to give greater support for young families, because without them, the basic pillars on which European civilization have been built for more than 2,000 years will be weakened. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker from the Romanian Senate, Gabriela Crețu.
Thank you very much, Chair. Almost all of us declared by now that the main issue we have to deal with is keeping the Union united. I'll be starting with the conclusion of my intervention. There are no concrete arguments at the moment for speaking about a different, better future for the Union. If we are lucky to avoid a financial crisis, we shall have only a repeated present, if you allow me such a metaphor. That means having the same worrying problems in mind. That means citizens' discontent and social unrest because of an increasing inequality and wrong or weak policies to solve these problems. This happens in spite of some of us using migrants as scapegoats. A fragile monetary system which is endangering, actually, the entire construction, producing divergence instead of serving to fill the gap. And thirdly, a weaker influence than wanted in shaping global future due to our lacking of European positions on foreign affairs supported by everybody because of recent trade divergences with the United States and our dependence on NATO when it comes about defense. Why an incurable optimist as myself, representing a still European optimist society, is speaking about lacking hope? Firstly, we have noticed that there is no political will for change. The new trend of replacing common European solutions with member states' responsibility, using subsidiarity as argument, cannot work for long. Member states' responsibility cannot be bigger than their capacity of intervention. And member states have already put in common their markets, borders, gave up to their national currencies and monetary instruments of interventions, and all have transferred important competences to the Union, sharing the others willingly. My German colleague was totally right in stressing this aspect in the morning. Secondly, because of economic reasons, the current MFF proposal is far away from the necessary transfers to keep the balance. We don't have yet a deposit insurance scheme, and we are rejecting genuine risk sharing between member states. The fourth industrial revolution has already started, and it would produce deep social changes, challenging our social security systems and our educational systems. We are not prepared for this, all of us. For debating deeper and more concrete the future, we decided to organize during our presidency an entire conference dedicated. Allow me to invite all of you in Bucharest in early April next year, before the informal summit in May in Sibiu, to contribute to our common future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Our next speaker from Slovakia, Martin Klus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank on behalf of Slovak delegation our Austrian neighbors and friends for their hospitality and wish them successful presidency. Please let me focus on two important points if it comes to the future and perspective of the European Union. First of all, let me mention so-called Bratislava process and activities that follows, including important speeches of President Juncker, Macron and Tusk. Crucial question is, what will be next? What kind of concrete steps are we going to take to discuss with European Union citizens important question, what kind of Europe they want? Second important point is heavily interconnected with constant undermining of European project from radicals all around Europe. The question is how to manage the European Union will really remain a irreversible project. In this case, please allow me one simple request, especially to our friends from Germany, Austria, Sweden, Denmark, France, and some others. Please don't question one of the most important results of European integration, which is undoubtedly Europe without borders, I mean Schengen area, and the principle of equivalence between citizens. Especially Europeans who live for decades behind Iron Curtain are very sensitive to such activities, which reintroducing any kind of internal border control or any kind of activities reminiscent of double metro system, respectively any indication of citizenship of two categories. Those which we can follow, e.g. in case of enlargement of Schengen zone, unclear ideas of European budget, of European Eurozone, or indexation of child benefits, lately introduced by the Austrian government. Please stop these activities as soon as it gets, and don't give good excuse to refuse European projects for radicals all around the Central Eastern Europe anymore. Thank you very much in advance.
Thank you. our next speaker from Norway, Michael Tetzschner.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, let me thank the Austrian Parliament for the hospitality at this meeting here in Vienna. Even though Norway is not a member of the EU, the future of EU is of vital importance to us. Our perspective is that Norway's security, freedom, and prosperity depend on Europe as a whole developing in a positive direction in a way that benefits future generations. Norway wants to engage in this discussion of the future of Europe because this is a discussion about our common future. I see the paradox in that, not being a member, we still want the EU to consolidate and even enlarge. We do not welcome the strong forces of disintegration in Europe. When the UK leaves the EU, the country will also leave the EEA agreement. The United Kingdom is an important trading partner for Norway, but the trade with the remaining E27 is even more important. Norway has therefore a keen interest in the Brexit negotiations and the future relationship between the E27 and the UK. I would, however, also like to underline that the EEA agreement, which secures Norway's participation in the single market, will continue to be the basis for Norway's relationship with the EU also after the Brexit. Our participation in the single market is vital, and the Norwegian government does not want to see any weakening of that arrangement. As many of you know, the Norwegian government has advocated that an exit agreement involving single market rules should cover the entire European economic area, not only the E27. I'm pleased that the signals we have received, both from the EU and the UK, indicate a willingness to ensure this. Moreover, the openness to dialogue and information sharing during the highly complex negotiation is both valuable and highly appreciated. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your speech. Our next speaker, Rainer Robrer, Deutscher Bundesrat.
Ja, Herr Vorsitzender, herzlichen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wenn ich auf die nächsten 12 Monate vorausschaue,
looking towards the coming 12 months, I feel rather alarmed. In 11 months, less than 11 months, elections to the European Parliament will take place, and it's going to be a test for Europe, showing if we are mature enough or not. The environment is going to be extremely difficult. The refugee issue will still be unresolved in many areas. We witnessed the negotiations conducted by Chancellor Merkel in recent days. The results were unsatisfactory, and the fact that the Brexit negotiations are not making progress doesn't make things easier. The trade conflict with the United States is going to further escalate. I don't know what this is going to mean for jobs and employment. The attempts of the United States and Russia to influence the elections by means of social bots are going to advance. Macron's proposals will be discussed, but we won't have a result by then. The only silver lining I can see on the horizon, Vice President Timmermans, is the proposals of your task force. I do hope that there will be good proposals, and I hope that these proposals will be taken up in President Juncker's State of the Union address. In the Treaty of Lisbon already, it was said that COSAC could play a stronger role. So I do expect that functioning subsidiarity and proportionality will have a positive impact also with regard to the participation of national parliaments in legislative proposals, and we can then generate a narrative that goes beyond the elections to the European Parliament and points the way for Europe in directions as proposed here by numerous speakers. Thank you very much.
From the Assembly of the Republic of Portugal.
Merci, Président. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I should like to thank the two vice presidents for their presentations and, above all, for sharing their reflections with us on the issues of our current debate. I thank Frans for what he said about the task force on subsidiarity and proportionality, and I thank Ms. McGuinness particularly for having shared her reflections with us on the Brexit situation. Your ideas help us better understand what is currently on the negotiating table. Frans spoke of a deficit in convergence. This is a challenge for the European Union, and I therefore think that the debate on the MFF is so important. It's an important debate because it's a discussion about what we want for the European Union until 2027. The role of the European Union in climate action, on the Paris Agreement, on digitalization, on energy, but also on convergence and cohesion, on fair taxation, and so on. Those are major issues confronting the European Union. I think it's extremely important to clarify and also to classify the debate, because the debate is focused too much on the financial framework. The fact that the Commission decided to present for the first time the financial framework to the individual member states has brought changes to the negotiations. I think what is needed now is a clear statement on what is at stake for the European Union, and then we will have to find the resources for these projects. I'd like to thank the Austrian Presidency for its reflections. I'd like to quote the proposal made by my Prime Minister on the occasion of the first European Council. I think it's necessary in the framework of the monetary and financial union to make progress. The most important thing is to find a mechanism of democratic governance of the European Economic and Monetary Union. And in order to complete and deepen the Economic and Monetary Union, we have to look at the divergences between the countries that are members of the Eurozone and those that are not.
Václav Hampel.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, I think in many areas the EU has a weaker role, weaker position in the world than it would correspond to its economic power. And I think in the medium-term perspective, we should focus on that. It's especially our international influence. I think we are looking more or less helplessly at wars, conflicts, other problems created around the world, problems that do affect us, and our ability to actually do something efficient to solve these problems is relatively low. This is in the face of the fact that collectively, our diplomatic corps would be the largest in the world. The diplomatic intelligence, the diplomatic network of contacts would be the largest in the world. The same goes for the armies. Collectively, our national armies would form the largest military force on earth, yet we don't use it as a single force. So I think this is one important thing to focus on in the future. Another one, I think, is the area of research and innovation. This is really a forward-looking aspect of our activities, and I think we definitely should strengthen further this area. And related to this is the area of education. Again, as a whole, we probably have the best educated population on earth. It is a big strength, but it doesn't go automatically. We should, I think, focus on this. And one small aspect of this education is education about the EU, about the mechanisms that are in play within the European Union. I'm afraid that the recent wave of Euroscepticism among parts of our population are also related to insufficient knowledge about how the EU actually operates. And without this knowledge, it's relatively easy to fall prey to demagogists. So this is one small, but I think important aspect of education and of our common future. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker from Serbia, Elvira Kovac.
Thank you, distinguished chair, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Serbia, as an EU candidate country, consider it completely normal that our EU partners first wish to regulate the relations within the Union itself in the best possible manner, but we really hope that the focus will not shift away from the enlargement of the Western Balkan countries. And if I may say so, most of the interventions, or at least the interventions made of a lot of the members present here today, made me really so encouraging. You all have Western Balkans in your focus. We are familiar with the fact that especially after the Brexit, EU citizens expect the Union to stabilize before any new enlargements so that it could protect them against the problems that have arisen, and that they want the affirmation of the EU economic power, values, and army. And there is also a need for the protection against terrorism. Statement made by Mr. Macron that the European Union needs to be redefined first, and then to continue with its enlargement, I must say, has echoed in our region. But those messages, so the messages made by Mr. Macron, are not in collision with our goals and interests. We are all aware of the fact that the European Union is really facing its internal problems. We understand and support aspiration of EU member states for internal strengthening and reforms within the Union, having in mind that this is important not just for the members, but also for Western Balkan countries that are exceeding it. It is in our interest that Europe is strengthened at the moment when we are ready to join it. Now, we believe that we should think more about what we can do with regard to internal reforms, fight against corruption and organized crime, public administration reforms, strengthening of the rule of law, and the like. And when the EU will receive new members, it is up to the EU. And it is up to us to be prepared by then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker from Bulgaria, Evelina Vasileva.
Thank you, Chair, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank our speakers for the powerful messages.
Subsidiarity is about taking the decisions as close to the citizens as possible. This would ensure that European citizens take ownership of the European agenda. In this regard, I welcome the efforts of the Task Force on Subsidiarity, Proportionality and Doing Less More Efficiently, and look forward to the presentation of the report. Vice President Timmermans said in Sofia that this is not the end, but rather the beginning of a decision on how all of us can improve the decision-making process. And I would like to stress that this is a shared responsibility. The Council, the Commission, the European Parliament all have their competences and prerogatives, but we as national parliamentarians, representatives of the people, we also have a responsibility towards our citizens and towards our common European home. One thing we learned about Brexit is that we cannot use Brussels as a scapegoat for everything and anything, at least not forever. We should all be more active on the topics from the European agenda and not only in a negative manner. We should not speak of the European Union and Brussels only when complaining. We should also point out the positive examples, the good work that is done there. And we all realize that trust is a precious value. We should strive to bring the European politics closer to the people, and here I would like to thank the European Parliament for their efforts in this direction. Our common efforts should complement each other for the benefit of our citizens. Therefore, I would like to refer once again to the writing that is on the building of the Bulgarian Parliament and became the motto of the Bulgarian Presidency. United, we stand strong. A lot of the speakers today talked about the difficult times we're living in and the challenges we are facing. It is recommendable that we are aware of these difficulties, but then we should also not be afraid to acknowledge that only together we can tackle the challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evelina. Our next speaker from the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, Michael Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and indeed I speak in my capacity as Director of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. The agency, based here in Vienna, is tasked with supporting the EU institutions and the Member States in order for them to be fundamental rights compliant in their work and activities. In that context, we greatly value our link to national parliaments and would wish to strengthen it, and it's in that spirit that we are so grateful for the opportunity to participate today as observers. As we look at how we can better support national parliaments in upholding fundamental rights, might I suggest that our data could be more frequently referred to at the level of national parliaments. We have an enormous repository of data and analysis regarding the actual situation on the ground for citizens and for other rights holders. During this current presidency, for example, we will launch important new survey results on the experience of what it is to be Jewish in the European Union. We will also publish again this year analysis of the situation of Roma members of our community. And in the ongoing context of the migration situation, each month we publish highly detailed human rights analysis regarding the 14 most impacted member states. As another suggestion as to how fundamental rights could be better promoted, how the Europe of values could be better reflected in the work of national parliaments, we would suggest that the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights remains a somewhat underused instrument at the level of national parliaments. It's not cited sufficiently, it's not engaged sufficiently, notwithstanding that it's a powerful, reasonable, balanced and ultimately legally binding instrument. And finally, Mr. Chairperson, might I indicate how we very much want to deepen our dialogue with national parliaments in order to do our job of supporting them. We will continue to do this by reaching out during our country visits, but also we would like to reaffirm the standing invitation for national parliaments to send delegations to meet with us at our offices here in Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you. Jarosław Opremski from the Polish Sejm.
Thank you. Some part of debate is strange for me. Do you really think that problem of EU is that when something is good, national parliaments declare, wow, it is our success, and when it fails, we explain to our citizen that is a mistake of bad Brussels? This is dangerous stereotype. It worked in Poland, but 10 years ago. We should believe that our society is not naive, is wiser. For example, our Polish society consider environmental regulation from Brussels, that these regulations are better than Polish government's proposal and law. On the other hand, we see that Brussels couldn't understand our post-communist bad heritage and shorter history of our independence. Maybe therefore we remember a long time when our part of Europe is treated condescendingly. We in Poland have now the problem of legitimization of our judicial system, and therefore our society expects change, because our judicial system during 25-30 years built a gap between law, regulation, practice, and feeling of justice. In long term, these elements, the liquidation of this gap, is more important for us, for our democratic system, than even some opinions about our reforms. Come back to the stereotype, bad Brussels and good decision in our capitals. I think the main problem is that we have not clear defined the competence between commissioners, between European parliaments and national parliaments. I'm afraid, I think in long term, we should increase competence, even obligatory to the rest in European parliaments. It is one of the solutions of this problem. And I want to end it and repeat Carl Bildt. More Brussels, more Bratislava, less Brussels. I deeply believe inside EU we have the potential and mechanism for self-repairing. Our common home, Europe. Maybe implementation of task group about yellow card will be first step in better time. I hope. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, Maria Triantafilou from Greece.
Thank you. Greece is opposite to Europe of borderlines and various speeds. On the contrary, Greece supports the common cause of those who desire a greater integration with the internal development of the Union, the strengthening of its external role, and the institutional integration. This progress has already been implemented in the area of defense and taxation. The cohesion of the European Union is a key factor in the security in the wider region. Therefore, we need to insist, first, condemn austerity policies and change the terms of the Financial Stability Pact. Second, strengthening the role of the international and European parliaments, while at the same time weakening the non-institutions organs. Thirdly, develop policies for ecological and social development, and involving civil society in the decision-making progress. Lastly, 2 points. First, Greece wishes a Balkan entity in the European Union. There will be a very important economic, political, and cultural enlargement that Europe needs today. Second, in connection with migration, I remind you that when we talk about migration, we overlook the most important cause, the war. Unfortunately, Europe has also contributed to the emergence of migratory flow. Now, what we are talking about, how can we avoid the problem? Difficult if we do not manage it collectively and especially if we do not stop the war zones. What Europe needs today? Democracy, peace, security, justice, secure world relations. And this is the future of Europe.
Thank you. Last speaker, Salima Belay from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Chair. First, I would like to thank Mr. Timmermans and Mrs. McGuinness for the diplomatic way of addressing these huge issues in the European Union. The essence is clear, and that is that we need to feel responsible for our collective problems that occur nowadays and which are bigger than our national institutions can address. But it's also clear that change is needed, so my generation and the generation after and after can also enjoy the same secure and optimistic future. I find it really difficult to listen to different signals that are being sent also today. On the one hand, some countries want to keep their absolute national rights and at the same time demanding a continued solidarity of others, or ask for solidarity when they enter the European Union. Still, I don't think becoming cynical is a solution. I'm sure that we will find a way to address these different crises. I would like to ask Timmermans, after his presentation this week of the Subsidiarity Task Force, what he hopes will be done by national parliaments. Because if different countries do not put this on their agenda, words spoken about subsidiarity by different countries are useless political phrases. And Mr. Timmermans, what do you hope when I meet you over a year and ask you, how is the European Union doing? Of course, I hope for my generation and the next ones that we survived and became stronger as a European Union.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your comments. Before I pass the floor to our speakers for remarks on the debate, I have to tell you something about this venue. You know, it was important what we have done here today, of course, but in former days, for example, the 8th Symphony of Beethoven, the premiere of the 8th Symphony took place in this room. Or in 1961, Khrushchev and Kennedy met here. In 1979, Brezhnev and Carter signed here the Arms Limitation Treaty, Seoul II. And at the beginning, this is Vienna, this was a ballroom. So it was the Viennese Congress in 1815. And built was this room by a famous Austrian Maria Theresia. So, thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much that all the parliaments of the European Union used the chance to take part here. But now the floor is passing to the European level, first to the first Vice President of the Commission, Timmermans, and then I will ask Ms. McGuinness, the Vice President of the European Parliament, to give answers to a lot of questions we had. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. And I was thinking about what you were saying about this room and the Hofburg in general. You know, we celebrate this year the centenary of the independence of quite a number of countries represented in this room today. And if you had come here, not in 1918, but let's say in 1912 or 1913, and you had said to the people here, in 5 years' time, the K und K, the double monarchy, will no longer exist. In 5 years' time, the Russian Empire will be dissolved. In 5 years' time, Europe's map would be drawn again. Nobody would have believed you. Just read, if you ever have the time, Chris Clark's wonderful book called Sleepwalkers, which shows how we ambulated into the First World War not knowing what was happening. I want to say this because 100 years later, you know, we cannot imagine the European Union disintegrating. but it could. It could. We cannot imagine things that we hold dear and respect to be turned back, but they could. If I see, for instance, the pushback in quite a number of societies in terms of women's rights, of gender equality, I never thought this would be a process going at lightning speed in the same direction, but I always thought it would go fast and then slow down a bit and perhaps fast again. But now there is actual pushback. There is a reactionary attitude to some of the fundamental values we share. I wanted to say this because only if we share a sense of urgency that what we hold dear and we think is important and our common fundamental values are not, they might be self-evident, but they're not self-executing. And if we don't embrace the sense of urgency that what we need to defend is vulnerable, then the consequences of inaction or the consequences of not talking back are going to be very serious. So what I'm advocating today is an alternative to rampant, blind nationalism, which is, I think, a proposition given to quite a number of European citizens who feel disempowered or feel that they have lost control of their destiny. I think what is in need today is a form of civic patriotism that is shared across the borders of our nation states on a European level. What distinguishes patriotism from nationalism, and this is not original, this is something François Mitterrand said many years ago, a patriot is proud of his country, a nationalist hates other countries. And I think that is a fine defining line that we should keep in mind when formulating European politics. As I said, and many of you mentioned the issue, migration is our most imminent and biggest challenge, because it has now become, which is logical after 2015, 2016, a highly political problem. It's paradoxical that if you just look at the numbers, there is no migration crisis. If you just look at the numbers. But at the same time, it's logical that having had the numbers in 2015 and 2016 and the huge feeling of anxiety that resulted from that, it is logical that the political ripple effects of that would extend in years after that, and that is what we're facing today. So the crisis today is more difficult to handle because I remember very distinctively in 2015, I remember very clearly that although there were different views in Europe, everybody knew we needed to come together because there was a huge material challenge before us. And so, you know, if you look at it now, there is less of pressure on European leaders to come together because materially the problem isn't that big. But politically it is. And it's a direct threat to the cohesion of Europe. So we need to face it. But then I want to make a comment about this. Those who believe that partial solutions are sustainable are wrong. You cannot solve this problem only through better external border protection and agreements with third countries and having perhaps even people's applications being checked outside the EU or etc. Yes, you can do all that, and we need to do all that. It's important. But this will only be a situation we can manage sustainably, and you just look at the demographic difference between Europe and Africa, the economic difference between Europe and Africa, if we address all issues. So those who believe we can solve this without Dublin reform are misguided. We will need also to come up with a European asylum policy. We will need to formulate the issue of solidarity. Do those who advocate registering refugees and migrants outside the EU, do they have an answer to the question, what if people have the right to asylum? Where will they go to if we do not have an agreement on how we formulate European solidarity? Do they just disappear in thin air? Do they go somewhere else? So, you know, we need to be honest about the lacunae or discrepancies in our reasoning if we don't look at the migration issue in a holistic way. And of course, the priorities you have depends on geography. The priorities of the Italian and Greek governments are different priorities than the priorities of, let's say, the Irish government or the Estonian government. But at the same time, we're in this together. We will have to find a common approach that will address all these issues. And I say this also to those who say it's not my problem, not our problem, we don't want migrants in my country, etc. I can understand the feelings, and sometimes I also have the feeling these feelings might not even be there or might only be latently there, but are also exploited in a political sense. But you cannot have your cake and eat it. You cannot say, I don't want to be part of a solution, and at the same time say, and I never want any internal borders in the EU anymore. It is my strong conviction that if we don't find a comprehensive solution for this issue, Schengen borders will become, in Europe, permanent borders again. And is this a price you're willing to pay? There's always a price to pay, whatever choice you make. So I really want people to be, I hope people are aware of that. And of course, we must be aware of differences in history, differences in culture, differences in composition of societies. And I think all of us are aware of that and are willing to take that into account. But at the end of the day, solidarity is not something you can apply à la carte. You cannot continue to demand solidarity in structural funds and other issues and at the same time say, but not here. This is not where we will share. So, you know, something's got to give on all sides, which brings me to the MFF. The Commission is faced with member states who are net contributors are saying not €1 more. Member states who are net recipients saying not €1 less. Member states who want new policies and say we need to put more money in new policies. Other member states who love the old policies and say not €1 less for the old policies. Well, all this together will never lead to a budget. So again here, we've put a proposal on the table that takes into account all these different issues. And at the end of the day, you know, some policies you can have or you can't. But the budget you will always need. So at the end of the day, you will find a compromise anyway. And that is the beauty of how we do business in Europe. At the end of the day, we come together and we find a compromise. And I'm sure we'll do that on the MFF as well. Now, on the issue of Brexit, I got some very clear, direct questions. What will the Commission do? Well, I think in the first place, it's a bit rich to get from London. The Commission now should finally start negotiating. You know, it's a bit rich. Let me stop there. I don't think it's the Commission that took all the time to get its act together, frankly. But apart from that, I think what Vice President McGuinness said is also the guiding principle I want to work on, and that is do as little harm as possible to all sides. That is our guiding principle. And I think we should judge what has come out of Chequers on that basis. Do as little harm as possible from all sides. Does that mean that this is the solution to all the questions? Probably not. But we need to negotiate in a positive spirit, in an open spirit, with all those who are willing to find a solution that could work. And I think we have shown so far that the Commission is willing to do that. I also see that 27 member states are united behind Michel Barnier's approach to the issue, and I think that will still remain the case, and I would strongly advise us to stick together on this. You know, we're now in the process of analysing the Chequers result in the white paper, obviously. But again, the attitude, I think, is very important. Do as little harm as possible because, you know, I shan't hide the fact that Brexit makes me unspeakably sad because I believe that we are stronger together. Both the UK is stronger in the EU and the EU is stronger with the UK in it. But this decision was made by the British people. The consequences of that decision affect all of us, and the consequences of that decision need to be assessed in a clinical way, but also politically need to be managed in such a way that we do as little harm as possible. I also want to make a remark about differences in national traditions in legal matters, and let me end on that. You know, of course there are many, many differences, and the European Union thrives because of its diversity, also in terms of our different traditions. But we also have treaty obligations. The treaties were signed and ratified by all your parliaments. In some member states, before becoming members, there were referenda, which sometimes got very strong support. And you can't fault the Commission to point to the fact that the treaty comes with rights, but also obligations and legal obligations. You know, we are like a referee in a football game. You're never the most popular person on the pitch, but without you, the football game, would be a lot more difficult to play. And you cannot point to differences in national traditions to sort of get out of treaty obligations. And I think the separation of powers between the judiciary, the executive and the legislative is a fundamental principle enshrined in European treaties, Article 2. And the respect for the independence of the judiciary is something we can demand because it's a European obligation, not just a national obligation. The respect for the freedom of speech, the respect for the possibility for NGOs to work, all these things are obligations deriving directly from the treaty, and I think it is only just that the Commission should point to that obligation when we believe that obligation is not being met. And by the way, incidentally, because Poland was mentioned specifically, of course it was said to me over the last 2.5 years, well, don't do it, don't say it, don't mention it, because you will play into the hands of Eurosceptics, the support for Europe will diminish. Interestingly enough, the support for membership of the EU in Poland has gone up over the last 3 years. Over 90% of the Polish population support membership of the European Union. You cannot pick and choose. If you want to be member of the European Union, there is a treaty that is binding on all of us. You know, if we abandon that idea, if we are not equal before the law, because the treaty is also law, then we go back to the situation this room knew before and after 1815. Then power will dictate our relationship. And we know that there's a man in Moscow, and sadly now also a man in Washington, who believe that power should dictate every relationship. Well, the European alternative to that is that law dictates our relationship. Treaties dictate our relationship. And there is not one member state so powerful in the EU that they can say that these treaties and these laws are not binding upon them. And the only guarantee smaller countries have against the power of bigger countries is that everyone subscribes to the respect of the rule of law, to the respect of laws and treaties. That is the basis upon which the EU has become successful. And without that basis, I cannot imagine the EU continuing to be successful. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vice President McGuinness, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And I think with the wisdom of Vice President Timmermans, we might even stop at this stage. So I'm going to be very brief because time is short. But just before I mention some specific questions that were raised, to make this point that the European Union does not have powers in every single policy area. So some of the issues around lack of convergence within a member state or problems within a member state around maybe social rights or education or health are member state competence. And I think responsibility needs to be shouldered at the member state level where that is the case, because Europe has many areas where we have competence, but not all. I also think that when we're talking about the European Union and trying to motivate people about it, sentences like proportionality and subsidiarity don't work, because people don't feel those as emotional, attachments for them. Equally, when we talk about doing more, or rather doing less more efficiently, I wouldn't put that on a slogan for an election poster, even though it might be a good thing to do. So I do think we need to start appealing to people about the fundamentals of what Europe is about, which is a very simple story of people sitting together in a room like we are today and believing that we can come forward with solutions that will help all of us rather than doing it separately, and deciding by treaty what those areas are. Notwithstanding the difficulties and the different views in this room on many issues, I can't see a better way forward for my country and for my European Union than we continue this process, even if it moves forward 2 steps and back 1 step on occasion. There is no better way forward. I was very interested in the debate on the MFF, which there are different voices. And I think the challenge, as I mentioned this morning, is to persuade people that new policy areas need funding. The Parliament takes the view that we need more budget to do that, but we know what the individual member states think. So a compromise will have to be reached. On issues like trade, again, I think the difficulty with trade is that perhaps people aren't understanding fully that the mandate on trade is given by the member states to the Commission to proceed on trade, and that we cannot have individual regions or indeed member states deciding to opt in or out, that trade is a European Union competence. Perhaps more debate in national parliaments during the process would help in that regard. I was very taken by the comments of Mr. Kirkbaum around politicians versus statesmen, or indeed stateswomen. And I think you are challenging all of us, that there is a time when we have to stop the rhetoric to feed the immediate appetite and look to the future we're trying to create. And that's about courage and bravery. And I think when it comes to Brexit, perhaps we were a bit negligent, that we didn't address the challenges of those who spoke about a wonderful freedom to remove themselves from the European Union. And we sat back too much, because look at what has happened because of Brexit. I think many are realising that there is no great, wonderful freedom, and how difficult it is to extract the UK from the European Union. So I think your comments need to register. And I'm not sure about your answer on the 4 freedoms and the indivisibility and this new proposal, but I think we need to reflect in time on that issue. The other point that I'd like to raise was raised around education about the European Union. Mr. Hempel mentioned this, and I think in some member states a lot of work is going on around that process. I know my member state does it at primary school level, the Ambassador Schools programme works at second level, and we in the European Parliament had the European Youth event. And we know that youth are interested in Europe, but they usually don't turn out to vote. So I think with your help, we need to encourage people to vote in the European Parliament elections and give them to understand that the European Parliament works with national parliaments, not against national parliaments. And I hope that throughout this presidency that message will resonate and that people will appreciate that that is the case. There's an interesting observation around the demographic, if you like, evolution of the European Union. And I suppose there is that concern that if we believe we can just look inwards, that's not a solution, that we have got to look outwards, and we've got to be global in our approach while mindful of the concerns of citizens. As Vice President Timmermans said, what we're dealing with now is the aftermath of 2015. It is not reflected in the realities of the figures today. But it's also important, and with the Fundamental Rights Agency Director in the room, to say that Europe should never abandon issues around fundamental human rights. One of the issues I deal with in the European Parliament, apart from the dialogue with national parliaments, is dialogue with religious and non-confessional organisations, and indeed Vice President Timmermans is also responsible in the Commission. I think we need to do more on this issue. I think that Europe, both internally and at a global level, needs to look and have more dialogue with religious and non-confessionals. I think 79% of the world's population does not have the freedom of religion or belief as a fundamental right, which is an extraordinary statistic. So I think we have a role to play in promoting freedom of religion or belief. And also, I think within Europe, to understand religion and cultures and how this can link with political developments. I think these two go hand in hand. Finally, what I'm quite encouraged by is that the issues of concern to the European Parliament and which we debate are equally of concern in the member states, and that the voices, which are sometimes different on some of the issues, are also different within the European Parliament on many of these issues. But here's the caution. And when we look to the European Parliament elections of 2019, if we have a chamber where there are many voices but no agreement or no consensus, we cannot make progress. I think that also happens in member states where the outcome of elections fails to give a concrete solution in terms of government. And that can be difficult for Europe moving forwards. And it is one of the things that I certainly will be talking about when I'm speaking to my constituents about the next European Parliament. When I chair Parliament, I see increasingly, on my right and on my left, there is unity of purpose, and the centre is not as strong perhaps as it was. But we all know that for politics to work, we need a majority that sees a vision and a way forward. So with your help again, I think we need to have these debates in the member states and in the European Parliament in order for us to reach a place in May of next year where we elect an assembly in the European Parliament that gives voice to all of those different views, but equally can find amongst political groups a way of reaching compromise on the many complex issues that we will be requested to deal with. And lastly, if I may say, in relation to Brexit, which Vice President Timmermans has made his observations and on which I would concur, we don't have, I suppose, the luxury of time. And I have to say, the British Prime Minister finds herself in a very difficult political situation, as we've just witnessed over recent hours. And I think she has also been quite brave and courageous in reflecting on the Brexit that will work for the United Kingdom and the European Union, with some of her proposals in the Chequers paper. I'm hoping the white paper gets published this week. And I think it speaks to a time of great uncertainty, not just on that particular issue, but on many of the challenges that we face as a community of nations. But as I said earlier, I cannot see any other way than people who disagree sitting in a room and coming to some agreement on a way forward. And the European Union, with all its rule of law and treaties, does that. Let's make it work better together. Thank you.
Thank you, distinguished speakers, Vice President Timmermans, Vice President McGuinness, for your statements. I think we all do agree that we had a very fruitful and interesting discussion following the motto of the European Union, unity in diversity. We can summarize the discussion in this sense. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, our meeting is coming to an end. I would like to thank all of you for attending the meeting, for your contributions and for your active participation. Furthermore, I would like to thank all the people involved in preparing this meeting. You did a wonderful job. Thanks a lot.